It's the week ending Saturday, the 7th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Theresa May giving a nightmare speech in Manchester, the collapse of Monarch Airlines, and the biggest mass shooting on American soil at a music festival in Las Vegas. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And with me from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll, Rebecca Gillie, and making her debut, it's Kari Wilkin. And Kari, you're starting the show this week.
Great.
What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are we being fed a line about our health?
I had half a banana for breakfast this morning, or I had a half an hour. It's always a half of something because they feel, it's that portion thing.
That approach to breakfast is not just bad for your metabolism, it's also very bad for your heart.
If you have a high-energy breakfast, you have much less atherosclerotic disease than if you skip breakfast.
Internationally renowned cardiologist and physician-in-chief at Mount Sinai led the Spanish study of more than 4,000 volunteers. He explained to me that high-energy breakfast eaters were those who consumed 20% or more of their daily calories at breakfast, compared those to breakfast skippers.
We are increasing the amount of the disease in the arteries by 25 to 50%. We know that this disease will lead to heart attacks and strokes.
Dr. Valentin Fuster there, ending that clip from CBS New York News. Kari, is this research by some shadowy breakfast cabal? What's going on here?
To be fair, this study was actually fairly legit as they go, but it's more the media coverage. I think it's just so symptomatic of this obsession with health stories that we're being bombarded with, to the point where no one knows what to eat anymore. I think you either sort of block it out and just ignore the lot, or cherry pick, So it says, you can drink your bottle of wine daily and it'll improve your health, at which you do choose to believe.
Okay, so this headline said you're healthier if you eat breakfast. What did the science say?
Well, the science, and this got a lot of coverage. I did a quick Google check. There were 49 versions of this story posted within 24 hours, and that's just at a quick glance. It was claiming, and I saw a lot of headlines saying, if you don't eat breakfast, you're doubling your risk of a heart attack, which is quite a scare story. There's 4,000 people. They asked them to fill in a questionnaire. So again, you're just dependent on what these people are saying, asking whether they skip breakfast, ate a light breakfast. And they came up with this conclusion that basically you're doubling your risk of thickened arteries. But when you read down, it's quite shonky when you go down. For instance, only 3% of the participants actually missed breakfast. So all of this is based on just over 100 people and what their health condition was. The measurements are only taken at one point in time. And I think more to the point, they're creating a causal link, whereas it's an associative link. People who skip breakfast are more likely to be less bothered with their diet. They found that these people who skip their breakfast also were more likely to smoke and drink. So I think it's a bit of a backwards way. I think it's of looking at it. It's more that maybe skipping breakfast is a marker of an unhealthy lifestyle. But obviously that doesn't make a sexy headline, does it?
No, it doesn't. And Arion, that's the issue, isn't it, with all this kind of science news? Genuine sort of scientific research is never going to be published on Mail Online with the sub-headline, correlation isn't causation.
I think that's right. And I think that this study is one of those it's a good example of one of those stories where this could be an outlier rather than a study that fits in with the general finding, which is that eating breakfast is either good or bad. So I do think that the Daily Mail and publications like it can be guilty of picking up a study that just makes a sexy headline and running with it because, do you know what? That makes a sexy headline. So, yeah, I think that's part of the problem is we're being fed news stories on an equal level as if every piece of nutrition finding is equally legitimate. And actually, they're not. Some fit with our broader understanding and some don't.
And it's also really damaging to the nutritional research industry, which is perfectly valid. There was a report published by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition a few years ago about basically people are ditching that area of research because it's just the public no longer trusts it. It's lost its legitimacy.
And is that the media's fault, Rebecca? That actually, because these stories get published every day, and the Daily Express is the really obvious example, isn't it? Yeah. Literally, we'll have margarine is good for you one day and the next day margarine will kill you. I mean, that's no exaggeration.
Yeah, I mean, it's 100% it's about the media. And it's a discussion. I've got a friend who works in science communications, and she has helped run workshops which are basically, they encourage journalists to attend and kind of teach them a bit more about what's going on in the science industry and ways to report that responsibly. But we've had this discussion, her and I, several times. But it's not that journalists don't understand or that they can't. Quite a lot of the major papers still employ a full-time science correspondent who obviously does understand science. But it's about headlines. It's about what makes people click on it. And it is a difficult call to make, because if people aren't going to read it, then what's the point in reporting on it from that selling newspapers getting clicks?
What's the nutritional benefit of clickbait?
I totally agree with what you're saying about sort of the role of the media, but I think also the other big factor is the role of corporate sponsorship. Going back to the breakfast thing, there have been so many studies sort of linking eating breakfast to reduced risk of obesity. And, and this study by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition made the point that they are just releasing the same data over and over again, which isn't really a valid scientific approach.
And those studies are backed often by the cereal companies.
And basically the article that really started off the whole, if you want to be slim, eat breakfast, that was funded by Kellogg's. There's a bit of a link there.
I mean, that was the saying of breakfast being the most important meal of the day actually came from Kellogg's.
Yeah.
But that's always been the case, hasn't it? I mean, the egg board told us to go to work on an egg. The milk board said drink milk. I mean, that's their job. It's your job as a journalist to tell your readers, have some skepticism about this.
But these are being represented as scientific studies. They're not mentioning, or, maybe some of the more responsible media outlets are mentioning further down in the story, this was sponsored by, Quaker Oats. A few years ago, they were saying about how eating oatmeal for breakfast reduces your cholesterol. I remember reading those stories. I don't remember seeing a link about Quaker Oats. Yeah. And there was an American researcher last year looked at almost 100 studies over 10 months, which had all been sponsored, and found that of those, only 9 gave results that weren't favourable to the sponsor. So they're presented as non-biased studies, but they're clearly not.
It's funny, isn't it, Arion, because in digital journalism, there's a big push that when brands do collaborative work, as it's kind of euphemistically called now, but basically advertorial as it used to be called, that has to be flagged up really clearly to the readers. So when you're on BuzzFeed and they've been paid by Sony to do an article, it will say in association with Sony right at the top, so it's very, very clear to a sort of switched on millennial audience. And yet in the traditional press, they'll publish these news stories as if they're news with absolutely no indication of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's meant to be clearly flagged, but it's up to the individual publisher to decide how stringently they want to enforce that. And I think it is a problem that a lot of people are being very clear about their association with brands, and plenty aren't. So I don't know. I think that we've almost got to well, and maybe this is your point, that we've got to take everything with a bit of a grain of salt, that because actually we
salt's bad for you. You shouldn't have a grain of salt for breakfast.
What's worrying is there is some really valid research going on. There is stuff we need to know, but how do you sort the wheat from the chaff?
Well, this is the thing, is that so many of the from a journalistic perspective, stories that say you can't eat this are always going to be more attractive than stories rehashing the same things we all know, which is don't eat fat, don't eat salt, blah blah blah. And it's just all of these stories about eat breakfast, drink red wine. They're just a smokescreen for the overwhelming majority of research is saying we are too fat and we must get less fat.
Just eat a balanced diet and maybe a bit less of it.
But actually, I think that point that you drew of the story of butter going out of favour and margarine coming into favour, and then after 30 years people going, wait, actually trans fats are bad and margarine's full of them and we've got to go back to butter. That's an anomaly. And actually, I think in the scientific discipline of nutrition's defence, usually they're generally coming to consensus on certain things. And like you're saying, Rebecca, we were all just too fat. We've got to stop eating fatty stuff.
But again, that doesn't make headlines. Scientists agree that eggs are good for you is not a headline.
No. I'd run it.
This is usually the question that's asked just as a sound level check. But Arion, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
I had yogurt. Try say it in Australian way.
No, say it in the Australian accent, definitely.
Mate, I had yogurt. And muesli and some maple syrup.
You say muesli as well in Australia. I didn't know that. What did you have, Rebecca?
I didn't have anything because I was too excited because I was recording another podcast with you.
Oh, that'd be the
just
Media
before this
Podcast with
one.
Olly Mann.
The Media Podcast.
Check it out, themediapodcast.com. Kari, what did you have for breakfast?
I had porridge, as I have every day. I'm a
Not
traditional girl, and it's
actually-
keeping my cholesterol low, apparently.
I had a plate of biscuits that I was given for free at the recording studio that Rebecca and I were
So
at.
does that mean you will
And
have
I
a
think
hashtag or you
well,
won't?
I think you could
I'm
actually tell by
confused.
weighing us all up physically at the moment that I would be most at risk of coronary
But you
disease.
had breakfast. You're meant to. That's meant to be a positive.
Fine, you can eat
true.
high-calorie
Got a plate of
breakfast.
Arion, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I'm wondering whether this week will be remembered as the week that Vladimir Putin tried to prevent the rise of a new Vladimir Putin.
The only coverage Navalny can get is negative. I mean, we don't have official censorship, but there is a great deal of management of national television by the Kremlin. For a majority, state TV is where they get their news. For most members of the older generation, this still is going to mean that they've either never heard of Navalny most of the time, or if they have, it's in a very negative light that he is connected with Western elements trying to undermine Russia, or that he is himself corrupt.
Anna Uratunyan talking to Ruth Alexander on the BBC's podcast series The Inquiry. Arion, this week opposition leader Alexei Navalny was jailed by a Russian court, and this is just days before a major rally. Why?
Right, well, he says that he's being jailed because Putin is trying to prevent him from taking part in next year's presidential election. An election, we should note, that Putin himself hasn't yet said whether he's going to run in or not. But according to the Kremlin, they say it was in violation of a ban on arranging gatherings of a certain kind, and so therefore it couldn't go ahead.
Gatherings of a certain kind.
So there's a law in Russia that was brought in after anti-government protests in 2011 and 2012, which bans unauthorized rallies and gatherings. And so the rally that Navalny was on his way to attend when he was arrested was authorized, but he was due to speak at a rally this Saturday, which is also Putin's birthday, in St. Petersburg, which Moscow is saying was not authorized and therefore is in violation of this law. So now he's off to prison for 20 days.
Even if it is the mainstream opposition's rally.
Well, actually, it's not the mainstream opposition.
Oh, okay.
So this is another interesting point, that Alexei Navalny represents what we could regard as actual opposition, but the opposition that exists in the Duma is often described as the systemic opposition, and they include these parties that were approved by Putin's party, including Just Russia, Liberal Democrats, the Communists, and so on. So Navalny himself is a fascinating character because he sits outside of the group that have been officially sanctioned. His party hasn't even been approved as a political force itself. So he sits completely alone, and yet he's really regarded these days as the only credible alternative and opposition voice within the country.
Well, he's got a huge online following, hasn't he? It's something like 3.5 million followers on his Twitter and Facebook accounts.
That's right.
Because it's the only way he can get out there, because he's just basically banned from speaking.
But interestingly, you never hear from him on state media, state TV. So actually his only voice is via the internet. There he has a great deal of power, and he has been able to draw a lot of people out to these rallies, but you never hear from him. So whole generations are not hearing his name.
But I mean, clearly he does have backing. It's like he stood against Putin's candidate in the mayoral elections, didn't he, 3 years ago?
And that's fascinating, partly because he got out of jail just before the cut-off to put in his official nomination, didn't have enough signatures, and was provided those signatures by Putin's party. So there's some feeling among some commentators that actually he's being propped up by Putin himself, so as to provide an alternative, a credible-looking alternative.
But didn't he get like 30% of the vote, and yet there was talk of there had been vote rigging, so that he was seen to get, a certain amount of support, so he's kind kind of this credible alternative, but he's not going to win.
Exactly. And so looking ahead to March next year when the presidential election takes place, there is this question of whether he'll be put up as a candidate in some way and then just get stomped by Putin all over again, and we'll have Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin for another 6 years.
And that conspiracy kind of makes a bit of sense, in the sense that it seems to me if you're going to keep jailing the opposition leader, you're going to increase sympathy for his cause.
Well, he's already been in jail 3 times this year, but only for very short stretches. But the kind of the murkier question is whether he's even eligible to run. He insists that he is going to be running in March for the presidential elections, but it was in June a court ruled that he was ineligible because of his criminal convictions. He was convicted of embezzlement in February in connection to supposedly embezzling a state firm, which he maintains his innocence and says it was all a setup. But at the moment, his status is that he cannot run, but he insists that he will run. So that process is a bit murky as well.
I mean, regardless, I think what is very clear is that Putin's own popularity is still immense, and pretty much whoever tries to run against him is going to be in some trouble.
Let's talk about that.
He's determined to stay in power, and he's been, since 1999? At that point, he should have had a maximum of 2 consecutive terms of 4 years. And, 18 years later, he's still sort of been around one way or another.
So let's just analyse why. Why is Putin so popular?
Well, actually, for a number of reasons. He comes in the long line of strongman Russian leaders that, if you wanted to look a long way back, could go back to Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and more recently,
I don't think Putin's
Stalin.
Campaigning on the basis of Ivan the Terrible.
But actually, if you wanted to find actual sort of more positive reasons, he has overseen the rise of a Russian middle class. He's helped develop education programs and increased pension provision. So actually he has done some things that have been seen to be beneficial by Russians, and also put Russia back front and centre on the international stage in a position of power. And I think a lot of people in Russia like that.
And have you seen those photo shoots, the topless ones? Come on.
Yeah, can't argue with that.
And I haven't seen Navalny posing with a bear. Should he be? You said people
possibly,
comparing him to Putin.
If he were to continue his rise and rise, perhaps he should. The comparison with Putin actually comes from a New York Times article I read that was making the point that while Navalny is charismatic, he isn't without a certain amount of controversy of his own. He once described Georgians as rodents. He got kicked out of the Yabloko party for being nationalist in his general sensibilities. And like Putin, he is neither left wholly nor right. So he sort of has this quality of Putinness that I think a lot of commentators, external and internal, find uncomfortable. Not only that, but also he is now the one force of opposition. There used to be a range of people, including your Kasparovs and your Nemtsovs. Kasparov, of course, is now in the United States, and Nemtsov was assassinated in 2015. So really, even if he does replace Putin, you're going to get another single charismatic leader. And I think that's potentially troubling.
Yeah, you can't help wondering if there's a bit of a trade-off going, you take 2018, I'll take 2024.
Yeah, in the sort of Medvedev handover style, so yeah.
I mean, could that be the significance of this week then? Because, I mean, his name hasn't been mentioned much over here.
I think it is significant that he's been jailed this week. Yes, it is the 3rd time he's been jailed, but we're coming up to Putin's 65th birthday on Saturday, and he said it was a nice birthday present for the president. I think it's just going to be really interesting to see what the next moves are and whether he manages to continue to be representative of some sort of alternative voice, and what kind of voice that is.
And last up this week, it's our very own opposition voice, Rebecca Gillie. What do you think this week is going to be remembered for?
Well, if you're listening to this with your laptop on your lap in your pyjamas, it's time to get into work clothes.
Kyle James of Rather Be Shopping has 3 work-from-home jobs that actually pay. First up, be a search result evaluator.
I open up Google, that's my homepage, and that's where I start.
The job is determining how relevant the results are to the search terms.
Search engines like Google, they want to maintain their search results. They want to make sure there's no spam in them. Basically what you do is you look through specific search results for specific keywords, and you make sure that Google's bringing back the best results for the user.
Google, Bing, and Yahoo will pay you up to $15 an hour to do it.
That was a video from the List Show TV. Find more inane list videos on their YouTube channel. Rebecca, what on earth have you brought onto my podcast?
Well, this is about working from home, which has been in the news this week. There was a widely reported University of Cardiff study that found that people who work from home are, on the whole, more productive than people who work in an office environment. They put in more hours. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, The Atlantic published a really great long-form article about IBM, which pioneered the whole concept of working from home in the 1970s, and almost half of its workforce at one time did not have a place to go. They were working from home. And then earlier this year, they suddenly announced that they were going to reverse this policy and that 5,000 employees would now be required to come into offices. So they are currently refitting a bunch of office space to accommodate all of these new employees. And
so which is it then, in your view? Is the trend either that working from home is good, or is the trend that companies are going to start recalling their work from home employees?
On the surface, it seems like those two things are at odds. But the main conclusion in the University of Cardiff study was that people are putting in more hours because they want to convey to their bosses and colleagues that they are not sitting, farting about at home, wasting time.
Are they actually achieving more, or are they just taking longer to do it because, you've got to fire emails back and forward to get across the basic message?
The research was a little bit unclear on that. I mean, I think the takeaway is that people are spending more time, working from home because of the prejudice which exists against working from home, and that still kind of lingers on, that you should be in the office, and if you're at home, you're wasting your time. However, the growing consensus seems to be that in the future we'll all be working from home. So if that did come to pass in 10, 15 years, then that prejudice would no longer be there. There would be no reason for people working from home to put in any extra time. So it kind of seems like the benefit of working from home relies on working from home still not being the norm.
I mean, the complication, it seems to me, Kari, is that working from home no longer actually really literally means working from home. And ironically, this is partly IBM's fault, of course, powering cloud computing. Sure. What it means is working wherever you are, whether you're sitting on the toilet or whether you're queuing for a coffee. At any moment, you're expected to be on your mobile phone and accessible to work. And so even if you work in an office, you're expected to continue working when you go home.
There is that danger. It can create so much stress because you don't have that cut-off point, I leave the office, I'm finished. It just goes on and on and on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more productive because, your concentration drops very quickly beyond a certain point. So I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be that much more productive, perhaps just more stressful.
Yeah, I was on holidays last week and for the first time in a long time, properly managed to switch off my work email and disconnect. And the first feeling that I had arriving back in the country was a feeling of slight dread at having to put it back on and be back on call 24/7 in that way, where often there's nothing. But if something does come in at 10 o'clock and it gets into your brain and then you don't sleep right, and I do think that there's a genuine problem in home working in that respect at least.
I mean, speaking personally, I find before it sort of became more common to sort of be working outside the office via through your smartphone, whatever, I used to get out of work, I'd sit and read on the train, just something. Now I feel guilty. That feels like cheated time that I shouldn't be taking, that I should be on my phone looking at work and emails and that sort of thing.
I mean, overall, more work must be being done through these means, otherwise businesses would stop doing it, right?
Are profits going up?
IBM has stopped doing it now, and Yahoo in 2013 announced that they were going to encourage a lot of their remote workers to come into the office. So what they seem to have found is, so on one hand, it looks like there is a disparity because there is a body of evidence that suggests that working from home does make you more productive, but there is also a body of evidence suggesting that it doesn't. The difference seems to be in the type of work. The proponents of remote working have kind of seized on these studies that show that those workers are more productive to put forward their case. But it seems like, so it depends on the nature of the work that you do. If you work mostly alone, then you are more productive. Generally, you're not distracted by what's going on in the office, etc., etc. However, if your work relies on collaboration, which I think increasingly, especially within industries like tech, a lot of jobs do rely on collaboration, it is much slower. It's what, as Kari was saying earlier, shooting emails backwards and forwards. It's actually really obvious when you think about it that even though these this technology is in a way like a miracle and it's so fast and we're all connected. We're not, I mean, we've all sat around waiting for a response to an email, and it's without that collaborative, you're all together in the room, you're bouncing ideas back and forth. You can easily spend all day talking about ideas that you could have discussed in person in an hour-long meeting.
And so much of communication is non-verbal, isn't it? Something staggering, like, over 90% of communication is through body language, that sort of thing. And you're not picking up on those cues via email or even via, Skype or whatever. You're not getting it. You can't be looking at everyone in the same way.
And, one really interesting stat that they talked about in the Atlantic article is that they did some research into like instant communication, like messaging services that are obviously used in a lot of offices now. And they found that the unexpected result was that you were multiple times more likely to use this instant messaging with someone who was close to you physically in the office than you were someone who was working in a different place. And they're saying there's no reason why that should be the case. That it shouldn't affect your decision.
Well,
there is
for British people, surely it's sharing jokes, isn't it?
Well, yeah,
what's that fish Mike's put in the microwave? That's basically what
true.
people are writing to each other on Slack, isn't it?
But they weren't expecting that result, and it shows that there is a human factor which possibly has not been built into people's predictions that in 10 years we're all going to be working from home.
Ever ahead of the curve, I should tell you, Olly, Dennis has recently introduced more home working. So we're being encouraged
for listeners,
to...
We're broadcasting to you now from a particularly glorious room in Dennis Publishing's shiny new offices. And these offices are open plan, actually, aren't they? Completely.
They are, yeah.
So it's, what do you call it when you it's hot desking, right?
Yeah.
Hot desking, open plan. Flexible working and working from home. They're having all their cakes and eating it here.
Yeah, and it's even weirder than hot desking. It's called warm desking in our building, and we're being encouraged to occasionally work from home. How are you guys finding it?
You know what? There's still a funny kind of prejudice against it. There was a lot of talk of, well, when we move to a different building, there's going to be a new change in the atmosphere. We're going to be embracing the remote working. And yet I still find there's a lot of, for instance, when they had the tube strike, the official company line was, do your best to get in, but we understand if it's going to take too long. There is definitely still a huge prejudice against working from home. And
I must say, I quite like it. I quite like working from home. Not all the time, but occasionally it's nice.
I've only done it once, and maybe I just had a bad day, but I found it incredibly stressful. I was all like, this is going to be great. I can sit in my pajamas. But because I wasn't there, I'm like, but I don't know what the flow of work is. So I've got to go really fast because I can't see what's coming at me next.
I think you need a bigger statistical sample to draw from to make your conclusion.
My one day was awful.
It's not. So IBM's new policy on working from home is not necessarily a rollback. However, we're not necessarily shutting down the whole idea of remote working, going back to the traditional drones at desks setup. They have put a lot of research into this, and they're basically trying to create new office space to maximize productivity, which involves things like small teams sat around one table, putting post-it notes up on the, communication is all supposed to be light now, so post-it notes on the wall rather than documents being sent around. So it's not necessarily saying the old ways were better. It is finding new ways to work together.
Weirdly, having a digital footprint for every conversation you've ever had in an office can be quite damning as well, can't it? Much better
scary
to have the kind of conversations you'd rather keep off the record.
Deniability.
Yeah, exactly.
But even so, I mean, regardless of if IBM are trying to spin it to sound like something positive, it's got to be a bit of a climb down for an organisation that used to market itself as a business whose business is telling other businesses how to do business.
I mean, it's incredibly expensive as well. I mean, they're spending millions and millions acquiring this new office space, which is bad news for all the companies who thought they were going to be shutting down their offices and saving tons of money with everyone working from home.
And also, is this going to lead to redundancies? Are they going to be trying to cut staff?
A lot of people have suggested that it might be a way to cleverly shed some staff in this reshuffle.
It gives you a very valid excuse, doesn't it?
Well, I'm going to bring matters to a close at this point. Kari, very promising debut.
Thank you.
If you're ever concerned in the future that you feel like you should be working when you're on the train, remember you can always listen to The Week Unwrapped.
That is true, and that's never hard work.
That's right. There are 38 past episodes of this show available on our podcast feed. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. That's it from this edition, though. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Kari Wilkin and Arion McNicoll. For more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, or of course you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.